Hi, everyone. I'm Maya Zuckerman. I'm the COO of Lumen. We are an agency of industry leaders who bring the breadth of experience driving innovation, creating the future. And I'm here with the CEO of Lumen, Tirza Hollenhorst. We are going to talk about the mind shift that leaders need to have effective strategic planning, especially during these times. So let's start with, why is this important? Why is mind shift important, Tirza?
Yeah, well, we're coming up on this phase of time where we generally engage in strategic planning, but we're in a really new era and we need to be approaching this in a new way. And so that really requires a new mindset. And the mindsets that we're going to look at today are not distinctly different than the general mindsets we need for the future of work. But just like what we saw with digital transformation, where we had a process that was already in motion, but that was accelerated by COVID, the same thing is to be said about the future of work, mindsets, and skills that are needed in order to thrive in these times. They were true before the pandemic, but now that we are working from home and managing things in this whole new way, the mindset shift is just that much more urgent and needs to happen with a greater emphasis and speed.
Yeah, and let's talk about even the building blocks of strategic planning, and as we dive into the topic of today, which is mindset. So at Lumen, we look at mindset, behaviors, and outcomes as the three building blocks. So let's start there, and then we're going to dive deeper into what is needed of you as leaders. And we look at everybody as a leader at Lumen. We see that everybody has leadership capabilities if we actually build in those capacities. Any successful leadership will start with the mindset, and really it's to cultivating the growth and inclusion and an invitation. And then next week, we're actually going to talk about the behaviors. And then the following week, we're going to finish the month with outcomes. So that's going to be just setting up our next trio for this whole month of strategic planning.
If you're getting value out of this video, click the like button.
So let's talk more about mindsets and what are the needs right now.
Yeah, so when we look at the future of work, the new kinds of mindsets that are needed are really sevenfold. We all need to become more adaptable. And so that's really the willingness to look at the situation, be in the moment of the situation, and learn who we need to be and what skills we need to bring forth in the moment. That also means a willingness to style flex the skills we're bringing forth, and to find these new ways of working and being. Then we look at what it means to be empathetic. So empathy pre-pandemic was important, but now that we're in this time where the level of stress that the workforce is facing in their personal lives is so high, and the level of disruption that people are facing as they're coming to work is so significant, we really need to be empathetic to our workforce and to our customers in a whole new way, appreciating that what was true for them in February just might not be true for them now. We also
just to add to the empathy, it's a word that is thrown around a lot there, but it's just a really reminder that everybody's going through this right now together. So your clients, your audience, depending on what business you're in, your leaders, your team members, everybody's doing that. And then different levels of empathy also, your single people are alone, your family are dealing with also teaching kids from home, and there's a whole, depending on, again, which region you're in. So there's a whole level of empathy and adaptability that needs to happen. And I think, the empathy is also really listening and also asking. The conversation of really asking people how they're doing and really listening to them to actually see if there needs to be more adaptability of time, more changes, especially because a lot of us are still working from home, those who can, then there might need to be a different way of, instead of 9 to 5, something else that works for some of your teammates, because it might, or some of your leaders, because what worked before COVID might not work now. So it's really something that a leader needs to think through during these changes and affect and adapt to that.
Mm-hmm. And so that's true whether you're bringing that empathy to your actual strategic planning process, or to how you're planning to reach your customers themselves. Both of those require a whole new level of empathy. Which brings us to learning, which is that willingness to constantly explore and integrate new information. So we've seen how rapidly we can learn new behaviors and new ways of working. And we really need to continue with that kind of speed of integrating new skill sets into both how we approach strategic planning. So learning to use new tools, learning to change our approach and our planning cycles even, as well as building into our actual plans, how are we going to learn throughout the next year? 2021 is unlikely to be more stable than 2020. We're going to see new forms of disruption that are going to come forth. And so that means that we really can't start that whole year out with this idea that the year is just going to be this stable, steady backdrop onto which we can plan. We need to build learning into the whole process. Maya?
Yeah, and beyond learning is also accountability. So are we, how is our integrity? How is our commitment? Are we having clear agreements? Are we doing what we say we're going to do? And also creating in the accountability a space for what happens when things break down and how do we clear that up? All of that is, again, as we are building our strategic planning, is going to be different than other years. As Tirza mentioned, we don't know what's going to happen in 2021, but let's think that it's still going to be very disrupted, and that's going to be the status quo. So how are we building in accountability for what happens when we need a change? What happens if, we can't just plan something and say, oh, because we said it's going to happen, and the reality changes it. How are we actually accountable for those disruptions as well, and say, hey, we've actually planned for that. We're accountable for if something breaks down, because we actually build that into the system. So those are part of what we're building in our mindsets. And then moving into enrollment, I think communicating both with information, so both bringing in the data, but also with our own personality, a leader that is emotionally available and also brings in the information, the hard data, is much more enrolling in moving things forward. So when we work on ourselves as leaders, bringing in both the kind of let's call it left and right brain conversation of enrollment of information and enrollment in personality.
So being able to stay focused on that big picture and where you actually want to be going and what you as an organization or a team want to be creating in the next year is vital. And so the mindset there is, okay, all of this is going to happen in the marketplace. All of these changes are going to happen in our work-life balance. All of these things are going to happen with technology. Through all of that, what's the vision of who we choose to be as an organization or a team? What's the vision of what we're going to contribute to the world that may need to be adaptable? We may need to change our tactics. We may need to change our business model, but we don't need to change our clear North Star of what we want to create and who we choose to be.
And let's finish with agency, your own personal power. How are you actually being in the mindset of continuously cultivating that? And as leaders, we're responsible. We're responsible for the company, of course, and the outcomes and the KPIs, but we're also responsible for our own self-regulation. And we're going to get into a little bit more of the how do we look inside ourselves and how do we shift those mindsets in a minute. But also we're responsible on and developing that self-agency and support and for our teams. So a leader that shows up for their teams, a leader that creates psychological safety for their teams is also extremely important. So we're going to move over into our 4 S's. So these are the key mindsets that will help all of us thrive, not only leaders, amidst VUCA. Volatility, uncertainty, remind me?
Chaos and
Chaos. And
and so as we move into this times where we're really experiencing that ambiguity, chaos, uncertainty, volatility that used to be reserved for these moments of war, but now really are the moments we're living in. If you're here in California right now, you're experiencing not only the shifts and change of the pandemic, but also of this extreme wildfire season that we're having. And so in order to really continue to thrive in those things, we really need to come back to these 4 S's. And sometimes people look at this and they're like, oh, it's all about the self. Well, that's one way to see it. But another way to think of it is that as a leader, if I'm going to be in service to my team or my organization, I really need to start with who I'm being. And so these mindsets do start with the self, but they start with the understanding that the self is here to serve a purpose and to be a leader on a team. And that's what you're here to serve. But in order to do that, you need to start with what you can actually change, which is yourself. So let's take a look at what it means to be self-reliant. So self-reliant can be kind of summed up in the phrase, if it's to be, it's up to me. That means looking out in the world and seeing everything as something that I am taking ownership of. So rather than just blaming circumstance or things that are outside my control, really taking ownership of what I can control and who we're going to be as a team in response to that situation. And so it's just a very different place to come from, to be like, oh, the pandemic, so our numbers are down or this or that, rather than say, okay, this is what's happened in the world, in the market. What are we choosing to create from here? Want to add to that, Maya?
yeah, and there's a phrase called duocracy, and it basically the explanation of it. If you see something out there in the world that needs to be done, why aren't you the one doing it? So the idea of being duocratic, it's whatever I can do, and as a leader, creating the conditions for your team to actually think that way. And also that's also the responsibility and accountability. The not my job conversation is problematic when it's all hands on deck. So being a leader and also modeling it, it's the old chop wood, carry water. How are you actually modeling that for your team as well? Are you, it could be even down to if something needs to be done and is not being done, that is actually below what you usually do, stepping up sometimes because maybe a team member is having a rough time, because these are not easy times. So I think that would be also the way we'd actually reflect on that, on self-reliance.
Taking this into what it means for strategic planning, if we're being self-reliant, that means that we're all taking ownership for having a great strategic planning process, and we're all taking ownership of the outcomes, both in the document, but then actually delivering against those outcomes. Which takes us into self-expression. So sometimes we really come to group conversations with a real need to be heard and a real need to be right. But the mindset shift here of self-expression is what I have to offer matters, my voice matters, and what other people have to offer matters. And so if we're coming from the mindset of self-expression, we find that we're more willing to ensure that everybody gets heard. And so we're actually stepping into that role of facilitating the group. And we're also clear on what our own unique perspective and our own unique genius is. So I know that I can have an opinion about just about anything, but there are those things where I'm sure that I actually have something unique to offer. And if I really focus in on what's my unique expression, what's my unique genius, and where do I actually have the most to contribute, and make space for other people to contribute where they have the most to contribute, then we ensure that we're really getting everybody's genius at the table rather than just chatter. And in a remote session, it's really important that we all control for chatter, because there's there's less opportunity for people to speak. Zoom allows one person at a time. So if everything's going to get heard, we need to ensure that we're expressing our best genius and facilitating that from others. Maya?
Yeah, and I think specifically for remote planning, another thing you should consider is when is, and actually plan for that, when is the opportunity for everybody to speak? Because sometimes you can't have everybody speak at all times, you can't have just continuous conversations, but actually time blocking the self-expression moment where for the next 2 hours, please everybody speak, we want everybody's opinions, and after that, we actually start making decisions. So planning for that, setting it up, inviting people to self-express, and giving them even, things like user stories or any other things that you actually are using to have a better planning session where it's more open. It would be a really great way to make sure that everybody's voices are being heard, but also it's done in a way that is contained.
Mm-hmm. And most platforms now enable different types of breakout rooms. So if you're facilitating the team, I highly encourage you to use your breakout rooms to give people a chance to share in smaller groups and consolidate the best ideas to bring back to the bigger group. Using that interface of the tool ensures that all ideas get heard and the ideas that we have consensus around actually get forwarded. So self-regulation, or what we might now call self-care, is something that we're all gaining just a lot of awareness around in these times. Taking responsibility for your well-being has never mattered more. In these times of stress and disruption, where we've lost many of the routines that actually supported us in feeling well, it's hard to get our exercise and go to the gym. We're having less social time. Many of the places and things where we just found relaxation or enjoyment have been lost or limited. Coming back to the routines and ways that we find a sense of centeredness and well-being is vital. And you, as a leader, you really cannot show up well for others if you have not shown up for your own self first. And so whatever this looks like for you, whether it's meditation or exercise or getting out in nature, it's not so much about what you do, it's that you are taking care of your mind, you're taking care of your body, and you're taking care of your sense of well-being. Maya?
And even through strategic planning, incorporating fun things on Zoom. I mean, and also seeing that your team is regulated. So reminding everybody to have a drink of water with them. And actually, hey, everybody, let's drink together. So you actually are seeing everybody drinking and actually having a moment. Yes, we can't eat together, but we can see to it that everybody takes a lunch break and eats something, things like that. And encouraging people not to be online, asking people to take a couple, maybe coming into the strategic planning a little bit later in the day and giving a couple of hours in the morning for your team to not be working. So they come in and actually can deal with whatever they needed to deal at home, because we know we're working from home. So we're doing double things all the time. So give your team like the morning off before they come into a strategic planning, so they're actually more relaxed and they can come actually and do the work wherever you can to support that, because also that will help with better planning and also a more regulated team. A more regulated, self-regulated team is also more effective, productive, creative, and feels more psychologically safe to talk about if things don't work, talk about things that they usually won't talk about. So all of that leads to all of these actions of self-regulation can actually lead to that at the end of the day.
And a small shout out to our friends over at Go Game, who've been hard at work creating games for teams to play online that increase a sense of connection and team creativity. And so there are several platforms out there for you to have your teams engage in these kind of collaborative, fun experiences that can seem frivolous, but are vital for building that sense of safety and creativity on the team. So finally, that brings us to self-organization. And we call this, I put the ship in leadership. So really all of this is about getting things done and creating value out there in the world for our customers and society. And if we're not delivering, then all of this is really wonderful experience, but it's not actually delivering on the bottom line. And so really that level of organization, that commitment to ship is something that we all need to take ownership of. And so what this can look like in the strategic planning is making sure that you're creating a clear, facilitated, organized plan of how you're going to get from the beginning to a completed plan that everybody is aligned and committed to and can actually deliver against. Because if we don't have a plan to get there and we're just kind of showing up to meetings, it's not going to happen, not in a great way. And just relying on last year's approach is definitely not going to get you there either. The things that worked for strategic planning last year are not going to work this year. That's because we need different types of plans, and we'll talk more about that in our outcome session. But also we need a different process in order to get there. And so you're going to need to design a process that actually is empathetic and takes into account the team that you have and where they're working from. I'll turn that to you, Maya.
Yeah, and as Tirza said, we're going to talk about it more in our outcome session, but it really is about the agility. And, we're bringing in agile, but the agility of a plan that might work for right now, might not work in 3 months. So instead of planning for the year, what are the smaller chunks? How do you actually have moments within the plan to check if you're on track or not? And do you have to pivot or not? Again, bringing in Scrum, sprinting, agile, all these methodologies are inside of them, have a built-in mechanism to actually do tiny pivots as needed. So when you actually are trained on tiny pivots all the time, in aggregate as a compound move, you actually see the pivot that it goes all, over your plan over time. And you can actually see if it's staying the course, it doesn't need to pivot left or right, up and down, wherever it needs, but it's not done in a way that's so jarring because it is iterative. So every 2 weeks you get to actually do that. So thinking through that and also teaching and equipping and upskilling your team to be able to think that way, do it, be comfortable with that. So then whatever comes in, they can always shift a little bit. Whatever shows up in 2021, we can actually shift faster than we did in this year, because this year we needed to learn our sea legs. Next year, we know how to actually sail the ship in whatever waters we're going to come through. So that is the path of also a learning organization, and we'll talk about it a little bit in the next couple of sessions we're going to have.
Yeah, so thanks for joining us for this Facebook Live. Again, we are doing a 4-part series on strategic planning. This last week was a great overview. You can go back and watch the replay. This week we're addressing mindsets. Next week we're going to be addressing the behaviors and the new ways of acting that we need to develop effective strategic plans. We're going to have a special guest for that one. And then we're going to close this series out on how do we think about outcomes? How do we think about our KPIs and the indicators that we need to use for successful planning as we go into these new times? Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks everyone. And please add any comments for us. And also if you have any other topics you'd like us to cover, please leave that in the comments. And you can always connect with us at connect@lumen.io. And we'll see you next week.